previously, using math and science, we pinpointed the Exodus to have occurred around the year 1200 BC. The pieces of the puzzle really begin to align when we look at the rule of Ramses II, who ascends to power at the age of 25 in 1279 BC and becomes the greatest pharaoh in Egyptian history.
During his long reign of 67 years, everything was done on a grand scale. No other pharaoh constructed as many temples or erected anywhere near the number of colossal statues and obelisks.
Ramses II, also known as Rameses the Great, is conceivably the grandest and most celebrated pharaoh of all. Interestingly, his narrative fits in perfectly with our timeline, which has the Hebrew slaves at the height of their population, reaching over 500,000 in number.
As a monument builder, Ramses II stands preeminent amongst the pharaohs of Egypt. Although Khufu had created the Great Pyramid, Ramses' hand lay over the whole land.
There's also a great deal of evidence in the Bible itself pointing to Ramses as being the pharaoh of the Exodus. The name Ramses actually appears 6 times in 3 different books of the Bible, all of them ascribed to the writings of Moses as he describes his first-hand accounts of the Exodus.
The Israelites set out from Ramses on the 15th day of the first month, the day after the Passover. They marched out defiantly in full view of all the Egyptians, who were burying all their firstborn, whom the Lord had struck down among them, for the Lord had brought judgment on their gods.
How can it be that the name Ramses is so common in the Bible and so familiar to Moses if the Exodus happened in 1446 BC, 142 years before Ramses was even born? Historians have never addressed this contradiction. Whether talking about the city or the pharaoh, the obvious answer is that the Exodus happened after Ramses came to power, providing added evidence that the traditional dates are wrong by several hundred years. The name Ramses does not appear anywhere in Egyptian records prior to 1292 BC, so the Bible establishes conclusively that the Exodus happened sometime after that date. Not only is the existence of the name Ramses in the Bible solid evidence that the Exodus happened after he rose to power, but it is also strong evidence that Ramses II was in power at the time of the Exodus. We find more evidence of this new timeline being correct when we look at the following Bible verse, which describes the activities of the Israelites after the death of Joseph.
So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh.
Archaeologists have identified these 2 cities with Tel el-Maskuta and Tanis, respectively, built by Rameses II from 1290 to 1224 BC. This quite convincingly establishes that the Exodus happened near or after the date 1224 BC, since the Bible specifies that the Israelites built those cities. Also, consider this piece of research, which is unknown to most biblical scholars today. The Bible, in 2 places, makes mention to the book of Jasher, which was also reportedly written during the 40 years of wandering. We today have copies of that book, and if we open it to chapter 63, it describes, in detail, the Pharaoh who reigned when Moses was born.
And it came to pass in those days, in the 102nd year of Israel's going down to Egypt, that Pharaoh king of Egypt died, and Melol his son reigned in his stead, and all the mighty men of Egypt and all that generation, which knew Joseph and his brethren, died in those days. Melol was 20 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 94 years, and all Egypt called his name Pharaoh, after the name of his father, as it was their custom to do to every king who reigned over them in Egypt. Behold, in the land are Pithom and Ramesses, cities unfortified against battle. It behooves you and us to build them and to fortify them.
While the book calls him Melol, there is no mistaking the striking similarities to Rameses II, who did, in fact, take his father's name, began his reign at 24 years old, ruled Egypt for a very long 66 years, and built the cities of Pithom and Ramesses. This is added confirmation that our timeline is accurate, and Moses was born during the reign of Rameses the Great. This new time frame is much further forward than most historians have ever considered. Finally, consider this element pinpointing the exact year of the Exodus. According to the Bible, the 10th and final plague inflicted on Egypt was the death of the firstborn, which included Pharaoh's firstborn son.
Moses said, "Thus says the Lord, about midnight I am going out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of the Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the millstones. All the firstborn of the cattle as well."
History shows that Ramses II's firstborn son, Ramses, died in the year 1229 BC, before his father's death. Could this be the true year of the Exodus? It fits with our timeline, placing the Exodus plus or minus 50 years to 1200 BC. It also dovetails with the biblical account of the Exodus happening in the reign of Ramses, and with the Egyptian historical records showing a rapid decline in power shortly after this time period. Following the death of Ramses II, we see a 60-year era with several more pharaohs rising and falling with varying degrees of success, but never reaching the grandeur of Rameses the Great. This period ends with the death of Ramses III in 1151 BC, who is described as the last great Egyptian pharaoh. Following Ramses III, Egypt quickly falls into chaos due to civil war and invasion, and never again dominates the region. As we examine this new timeline in fine detail, everything is falling into place quite nicely. But now get ready to be blown away, as a small detour is going to reveal the most amazing portion of the research yet. Let's revisit the Amarna period and see if we can find additional evidence relating to Joseph and try to find clues of his identity in the Egyptian politics of that era. According to our calculations, Joseph rose to power in Egypt in the time of Amenhotep and continued to live in the region throughout the reigns of Akhenaten, Tut, and Ay. If the biblical accounts are accurate, certainly there would be mention of him. Poring over the history books of Amenhotep, we find many references to a long and prosperous reign, but no mention of any advisors that could have been Joseph. Next, we turn our attention to Akhenaten. This is the pharaoh who turned Egypt upside down by worshipping a new monotheistic god named Aten, which translates to the Lord in Hebrew. He also wrote a poem to Aten that later seems to have been carried on by the Hebrews during the Exodus. Is it possible this pharaoh was actually Joseph himself? The timeline fits, and the behavior of Akhenaten seems perfectly in sync with the character of Joseph. But this theory falls apart when evidence shows him to be of royal Egyptian blood and the son of Amenhotep III. Next in line, King Tut was the boy king who died at 19. But what about his successor, Ay? This section is going to amaze you, as we methodically fit the puzzle pieces together into what is sure to be the most controversial aspect of this documentary. Let's take a close look at the Pharaoh Ay and ask the question, who was he? One thing we know is that he died in 1320 BC, the same year as Joseph according to our new timeline, and worshipped the single god Aten. Interesting, but what else do we know about this pharaoh? The truth is, modern historians and Egyptian scholars know almost nothing about this pharaoh. In reality, no one is certain who this man was, where he came from, who his parents were, or how he rose to power in the first place. His entire reign is shrouded in mystery.
The grounds on which Ay based his successful claim to power are not entirely clear. The commander of the army, Horemheb, had actually been presumed to be the boy king's heir apparent and successor.
Who was Ay? Where was he born? At what age did he come to power? No one knows. One of the only certain facts we know is that he was an old man when he became king.
Since he was already advanced in age upon his accession, Ay ruled Egypt in his own right for only 4 years.
Could Ay and Joseph, son of Jacob, be one and the same person? This would be a most remarkable theory if proven correct and would change the way we look at Hebrew and Egyptian civilization. But is it possible? There appears to be nothing known about the Pharaoh Ay that would disqualify him from being Joseph. No DNA records, no known historical origin, and no known lineage to eliminate this possibility. But there are several pieces of evidence to support the theory. To begin with, we know that Ay was a commoner, not born of royal Egyptian blood. In fact, no one knows irrefutably who Ay's parents were, who his wives were, or who his children were. He appears to have come out of nowhere, ruled Egypt as its highest authority, and then disappeared. Remember, this is in a civilization that kept meticulous records of their pharaohs. No historian has been able to explain this convincingly. We know Ay ascended to power at an advanced age and died in 1320 BC. According to our genealogy timeline, Joseph would have been an old man, but likely still very active in Egypt's ruling authority until he died in 1320 BC, at the age of 110. Both timelines match up perfectly. Also, Ay's inscription, found in Egyptian hieroglyphics, is translated as the Father of God. This is very interesting because Joseph, according to the Bible, is the person who introduced God, the Lord, to the Egyptian people following the interpretation of Pharaoh's dream. We further know that Ay was the chief minister of Akhenaten, which helps explain Akhenaten's conversion to the new religion. Our theory states that Joseph was the catalyst of Akhenaten's conversion, and we see evidence that Ay had great influence over Akhenaten. This further supports the link between Ay and Joseph. We also know Ay was the last of the Egyptian pharaohs to worship the single god, Aten, and following his death, future pharaohs tried to expunge his name from the historical records. This is strong evidence that he was considered an outsider by other Egyptians. Also consider these two writings.
Earlier in life, Ay had achieved the title of Overseer of all the horses of His Majesty, the highest rank in the elite charioteering division of the army.
And of Joseph.
So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, "Make way!" Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt.
And possibly the most significant pieces of evidence are derived from what the Bible says about the end of Joseph's life. The clues come from two Bible passages. The first is this.
So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt.
This is quite an amazing verse because it not only tells us that Joseph was still in good standing with the Egyptian people at the time of his death, but also he was embalmed, likely as a mummy. Finally, we are told that he was buried in a tomb in Egypt. Is this verse telling us he was embalmed as a royal pharaoh and placed in a king's tomb in Egypt? It certainly hints at that. Embalming and tomb burial were not done for common people in Egypt, but were reserved for those of highest esteem. Is it possible Joseph was mummified and buried in the Valley of Kings? The evidence points to yes. And finally, there is this verse.
Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the Israelites swear an oath.
We know the remains of Joseph were taken from the tomb by Moses and the Israelites and brought back to Canaan, where he was buried with his fathers. And guess what? With all the digging that has taken place in Egypt, it turns out the remains of Ay have never been found.
Ay's mummy has not been identified. In fact, it is highly unlikely that Ay's mummy survives in view of the destruction wreaked in his tomb.
In fact, he is the only pharaoh of this era that does not today have a mummy in some museum. A startling discovery, and one that fits the theory that Ay was in fact Joseph. Modern historians have tried to explain away this mystery by alluding to the fact that Horemheb, his successor, may have destroyed the corpse, but this theory leaves questions as to why he would not have done the same to the other Amarna pharaohs.
This damnatio memoriae seems to have been carried out on the instructions of Ay's successor, Horemheb, which raises the curious question as to why he did not order Tutankhamun's tomb to be similarly attacked and robbed.
Putting all this together is quite convincing evidence that Joseph was in fact the Pharaoh Ay of the 18th dynasty of Egypt, who ruled 4 years until his death in 1320 BC at the age of 110 years. His remains were then removed over 100 years later by the Israelites and brought to Canaan, where he was buried with his fathers. The discovery of Ay is truly revolutionary and, if true, validates this new time frame of the Exodus, as well as the accounts of the early Hebrews mentioned in the Bible. But what about this year 1229 BC being the exact year of the Exodus? As we will find out in the next episode, a careful examination of that date reveals it to be incorrect. But digging even deeper leads to some amazing discoveries that perfectly identifies the true date of the Exodus. Stay tuned.